Chapter 18. Johnny's Old Gray Horse. Jones offered $100 for the pelt of the king. News of it spread first along the main trail, and then into the furthest recesses of the trapping country. Jones himself had started back to civilization to recover his health. Old Jim heard it through a ranger. He had been expecting something like this. "The wolf's worth it," was his remark to Johnny. "He's what they call a record-sized animal, and a grand trophy to have as a rug in a big house. Now we'll start our trapping." But the great black had gone from that vicinity, taking his pack with him. Jim's traps and snares might just as well have been set in his yard at home. Johnny had never felt the hostility toward wolves that Jim had tried hard to teach him. Jim's advice was to exterminate them if possible, as obnoxious creatures that constantly preyed on all animals prized by man. But Johnny had learned a great deal from the other hunters and trappers, and whiled away the time on the slow pack horse journeys by observing everything along the route and deciding things for himself. At such times he rarely carried a gun, and if he did have one, almost never used it. It was natural, therefore, that Johnny, who was almost constantly in the mountains, began to be looked upon by the wiser animals of the forest as a peculiar but inoffensive creature from whom it was unnecessary to hide. It had taken the wary King Wolf some time to overcome his first bad impressions of the forester, but his intelligence and experiments eventually convinced him that Johnny had become a safe neighbor, one who minded his own business and molested no one. So while there was always a guarded or watchful attitude on the part of the big wolf and those he led, there was no real fear when their paths crossed, provided the forester was alone. Johnny usually rode a buckskin horse named Bob and led an old gray pack horse affectionately called the Grouch. This pack animal, the first he had ever possessed, had been sold to him in his first green days in the service as the finest horse in all Alberta. Johnny had liked his powerful build and kindly eyes, and did not learn until later that though one of the most willing beasts imaginable, he possessed the roughest gaits of any horse in the province. No one could long endure the heaving quality of his stride and walking, nor the rattle of his awkward trot. Therefore the Grouch was always given the lowly task of carrying the food and other camp necessities. Ordinarily, Johnny managed to get the horses out of the mountains before much snow had fallen in the autumn, but after he parted from Jim and moved on to one of the rangers' cabins, he was at once caught by an early blizzard and forced to keep both Bob and the Gray there until a thaw set in. Instead of a thaw, there was more snow, and a high wind which choked the passes and trails with deep drifts. Here was a serious situation. In vain, Johnny tried to break a way through for the horses. In the end, he had to leave them where they had been turned out to forage for themselves, and go back on his snowshoes to the settlement for more supplies. He decided that the two could shift for themselves for a few days by pawing the snow away from the grass, and by eating willow twigs in the manner of the moose. But when he reached civilization, he found a letter calling him east. He had to go. Therefore he dedicated to one of the trappers the task of going back to take care of the horses. This trapper delayed until there was a warm rain and general thaw, then set out on the mission. Halfway to the shanty he met Bob. The nimble little animal, scarcely more than a pony, had followed the paths made by the moose, and thus gradually worked his way toward home through the remaining snow. The Grouch, clumsy, big-boned, and slow, could not have followed unaided had he wished to. The trapper at once decided that since the Gray was not with his buckskin companion, he must have fallen down a precipice or starved to death. Certainly Bob was thin enough after his hard days in the snow, so the man was glad to turn back without looking further into the fate of the other animal. Months went by. Then Johnny came west once more and looked in the barn for his two faithful horses. To Johnny's surprise, only Bob was there, but soon he found out the story that had been told by the trapper. The man himself was away, so he was spared for a time the anger which the forester would have vented upon him. For Johnny was sure the grouch had not fallen over any precipice, that indeed the well-trained, faithful old horse might have died rather than leaving the camping place where he had practically been told to stay. It took Johnny just a half hour to get a sled laden with his camping outfit and 2 bags of oatmeal for the horse. He set out alone and covered 15 miles before night. 6 days later, he reached the cabin. It stood at the edge of an open glade beside the river, just a brown lump in the deep snow at the very foot of Round Top Mountain, and there was no sign of the grouch. Johnny, sick at heart, opened the cabin door, brought in his supplies, then at once started out on a hike around the clearing to find out, if he could, what had happened to the poor old horse. Snow over 3 feet deep covered everything, crusted in places, soft in others, but oppressively plentiful. In the glade there were only coyote tracks, but along the river the moose had worn a path among the willows. Here Johnny suddenly stopped and gazed at well-known tracks, the footmarks of the king and a number of other big wolves. Evidently, they had come and gone many times. A sudden pang pierced Johnny's conscience. He remembered some of Jim's stories and pictured a hungry pack surrounding the horse, springing at its legs and dodging back as it bravely kicked and bit and fought them in the snow until it no longer had any strength and finally fell there in the shadow of Old Round Top. Fiercely he followed the tracks, believing that they might lead to whatever bones were left to mark the scene of terrible feasts. Faster and faster he strode until, in a sweat in spite of the cold, around a willow clump, through a fringe of spruce, and then to a jack pine thicket at the very base of the mountain. Suddenly ahead of him, the trees thinned out. He was looking across a little glade at one of the most remarkable sights he had ever seen. On the ledge at one side, scarcely 100 yards away, stood the Black King, while behind him sprawled or sat 5 other wolves, among them one beautiful gray. The leader had heard and recognized his step, for he was looking in the direction without apparent fear. As Johnny came nearer, the wolf turned away and walked slowly toward the trees, the other wolves taking their cue from him and also moving out of sight. Directly below the ledge, between some immense boulders, stood the grouch, as if in a stall. Around him in a great circle the snow was scraped or stampeded to the very earth, so that the place looked like a corral or drove yard, where the constant shuffling of hooves have worn off snow and sod until in places rocks and subsoil were laid bare in spite of the freezing cold. Here the game old horse had lived through all those weeks, digging for grass and bushes, chewing twigs and bark from the trees, and eating snow whenever he felt thirsty. And here the wolves had found him. It had happened on a windy night, not many days after Johnny had left. The king came upon the forester's trail and knew that the cabin must now be deserted. Therefore, when next hunting in that direction, he did not hesitate to keep straight down the river through the clearing. He and the pack had then taken a look at the lonely cabin, sniffed around the paths, and finally headed for the base of the mountain. Suddenly encountering the almost white old horse in the snow completely surprised them. They melted into the shadows and studied the situation from a safe distance. It was not according to tradition to find a horse all alone in these mountains. They knew something was wrong about it, so away they went, but on the following evening they came cautiously back to have another view and try to solve the mystery. Calmly, the grouch stood there and looked at them. The king still was mystified. The more he looked around and watched the horse, the more strange the thing seemed. After that, the wolves came often, usually after their hunting when they had nothing special to do and felt like being amused. The horse stood in his self-appointed stall or lay down in it. He showed no fear of them. He was just waiting with the patience of blind faith for Johnny to come. And so it happened that the idea of harming the lonesome old horse scarcely entered the minds of the pack. He was just a thing of interest to them, an unsolved mystery in which there was perhaps a tinge of danger. That he did not starve was a miracle. The snow had deepened and hemmed him in. His iron shoes had been loosened by the pawing and finally lost, leaving the feet too soft and fragile for much more work in the frozen ring. It was really his sound common sense that had saved him. He chose in the first place a glade that was full of grass and protected on all sides from the high winds. Then, to conserve his strength, he moved about very little and therefore required less food. Johnny found him to be very thin, to be sure, a mere hat-rack of bones covered with thick, long hair, but his manner was alert. Like an old soldier at his post, he stood there in his bleak stall with his head up and a sparkle in his eye. As he looked at him, Johnny felt a sudden lump rising in his throat. "Hello, old comrade," shouted the man, and waved his arms. At once the horse's head turned in his direction, and the grouch looked him over as if scarcely believing his eyes. Then a shrill whinny rang out, and the poor old gray backed out of his rock stall and came shambling across the ring as fast as his sore feet would let him. When they met, a film had sprung up in Johnny's eyes which almost blotted out the scene. "But you're going to be taken care of now, old fellow," the horse was assured. "You've got a lot coming to you to make up for this." And Johnny got right to work. He first fed oatmeal in handfuls, then shoveled away heaps of snow until a patch of good dry grass lay exposed. Next, he made a great bed of leaves and spruce twigs in the hard stall to serve until he could build a lean-to on the chimney side of the cabin. Grease was rubbed into the badly cracked hooves. In 3 days, Johnny, regardless of blistered hands and tired back, had a fairly snug log stable built as an addition to the cabin, and a snow path dug all the way to the glade. A thaw had helped him. Slowly, and with a certain pride, he led the grouch along this path and introduced him to his new quarters. That was in the morning. In the afternoon, he heard a dull roar and looked up in time to see a snowslide tearing down the glittering side of Round Top. It had quickly filled the glade and piled itself high over the hard-trodden ring. Had the work of rescue been delayed for only a day, the old horse would have been blotted out. 2 weeks later, on a cloudless morning, the foresters started the return trip. 6 wolves stopped near the river's edge to watch him. When he moved out of sight, he heard one of them gruffly howling and smiled, for he had learned something about these wolves. After many painfully slow days on the thawing trail, he managed to get back to the settlement with his camp stuff rattling grandly on the grouch's old back instead of on the sled. He felt at peace with the world, for he knew now that actually he had bought the finest horse in all Alberta.